It's a question that comes up a lot.
Looking around this world, there's so much suffering.
If God really loves us so much,
wouldn't He remove all of that suffering?
Why does Allah allow such evils and suffering?
How and why?
Is there so much suffering in the world?
Is it logically inconsistent, forgive me, with the existence of God?
The answer is rarely satisfying.
God works in mysterious ways. Someone's like, yeah, that's right, Pastor. My Bible says God works in mysterious ways.
Allah knows best. Allah knows best. Sometimes Allah make this thing happen with a reason.
Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust Him for His grace. Behind a frowning providence, He hides a smiling face.
In the traditional conception of God as being a man with a big white beard perched on a cloud, looking down and pulling the strings in the lives of his creations, what other interpretation could there be, other than such a God being negligent at best, or at worst a psychopathic megalomaniac? Consider, for example, Gilles de Rais, Pompilid wasps, or Unit 731, all examples of unimaginable depravity in God's golden kingdom on earth. Explain that. So let's take a closer look. More than any other, suffering is an experience that defines our relationship to the world. Its counterpoint, joy, is always fleeting. It seems to go more than it comes on. What remains is the weight of joy's absence, a condition that may best be defined as suffering. The sense that something is missing, the sense that we're not whole. So for many of us, our whole lives are spent in various states of suffering. We're either feeling it keenly, immediately, having it rupture the very ground on which we stand, or we're waving it away, riding around on whatever unique blend of compulsive behaviours allow us to escape it moment to moment. But like a person hopping from foot to foot on hot coals, suffering is never escaped from. Not really. It is a condition of being alive. It is, perhaps, the condition. Moreover, since the human experience and the experience of suffering are so closely interlinked, since they are practically synonymous, asking why creation sees fit to make us suffer is the same thing as asking why we're here at all. The meaning of life, no less. However, there are a number of categorical assumptions that need to be addressed first. To answer the question, why does God allow suffering, we must first attempt to determine what is meant by the word God and suffering. And, come to think of it, allow. Implicit in the question being posed here is the suggestion that suffering itself may be somehow more endurable, that it may be alleviated, if appropriately contextualized within a wider frame of meaning. Throughout C.G. Jung's long and varied career, one thread that remained central to his work was the idea that the loss of religion in Western culture crippled the psyche of the modern human individual. Jung, who was no supporter of the dogmas of organized religion, was doubtlessly advocating rather that the word be used in its root sense. Religion meaning literally to reconnect. Since the awakening of the human psyche, anywhere between 10 and 100,000 years ago, human beings have aspired skywards. This desire to reconnect with whatever lies beyond the terrestrial realm posits a question of its own. To reconnect with what? Joseph Campbell was a famed professor of mythology and comparative religion. He spoke of how, in order to understand what is meant by God, any image of a deity must remain transparent to transcendence. To explain what he meant by this, we might imagine a huge stained glass window, as wide as a warehouse. In front of it are gathered delegations from the innumerable religious denominations. Each pane of the window has impressed upon it the respective image of however the deity is customarily represented for whichever faith group stands before it. Christ for the Christians, a mandala for the Buddhists perhaps, and a portion of ecstatic geometric patterning for the Muslims. Despite these varied representations of the divine, the light behind the great window is the same for all. It animates all the panes equally, and here represents the foundational universal truth which the images point towards. For the images themselves are culturally informed. They allow, or should allow, an access point through which the deity can be approached by whichever particular culture it was designed to speak to. However, it would be a mistake, Campbell argues, to allow the window to become opaque. In this way, what is behind it would become obscured. What is left would be a dead religion, idolatry, the worship of an image rather than the thing itself. Not wanting to digress too much here, it might be useful to briefly consider the discipline of psychogeography. There is a reason why in Eastern cultures divinity permeates every aspect of reality. Buddhism grew principally out of social models based around mass agriculture. Civilizations that sprung from natural landscapes so vast as to be almost inconceivable to the European mind. It stands to reason, therefore, that the spiritual conceptions of these more collectivized cultures would be uncentered. Christianity, meanwhile, really started to flourish in the rocky outcrops of southern Europe, landscapes better suited to a hierarchical outlook, where collectivization was not only less necessary, but would have been more difficult to administrate. It's easy to see how this idea could be extended to the political sphere. In a loose way, communism is the political equivalent of Buddhism in its uncenteredness. The structure of Western capitalism, meanwhile, maps nicely onto the hierarchical Christian trinity. What I'm getting at with all of this is the importance of remembering the archetypal foundations of religious imagery. For God is not a man sitting on a cloud, nor is he a conglomeration of geometric patterns. Neither even is he some kind of divine dust that permeates the entire universe. These are archetypes, concessions to the human psyche's inability to conceptualize truth in essence. They are metaphors that allude to a reality that exists beyond the realm of form itself. For now, it will suffice to proceed with the idea of God as being the most fundamental aspect of the psyche. God as consciousness itself, the foundational field of awareness inside which all aspects of reality as it is experienced appear. Now that we have established a working definition of the word God, we come to the question of suffering. Swiss philosopher and historian Gebser outlined 5 stages in the development of human consciousness. The first of these being the archaic structure. Archaic consciousness is zero-dimensional in the sense of a total absence of differentiation. There is no subject-object polarity, let alone duality. No differentiation between self and other, between soul and nature, between the individual and the universe. In this primordial state of oneness, prior to our proverbial fall, the condition of suffering as we know it today would not exist. Despite the fact that some animals may indeed suffer, for the sake of cohesion, let's use the animal-human dichotomy to determine a distinction between suffering and pain. There is nothing to be done about physical pain, the body being assailed. It is a fact of life. a biological mechanism that has evolved alongside the organism in a manner most appropriate to survival. The word suffering, rather, will here be employed in the existential sense, the soul being assailed, or for those with a more physicalist outlook, the psyche. But it's the same thing, literally. For Gebser, the concept of the human soul, as distinct from the soul of nature, only began to emerge during the second magical structure, tribal cultures. And it wasn't until the third phase in our development, the mythical structure, around the time of the first mass civilizations, that we truly conceived of ourselves as being somehow separate from the anima mundi, or world soul. As one might expect, this was a time when organised religion really began to take off. Attempts to reconnect with what we lost. Towards the end of his life, Jung wrote what many consider to be his most important work. Answer to Job is his analysis of the Book of Job, one of the most enduring suffering myths in the canon. In the story, God points to the character of Job as an example of his goodness at play. And assuredly, Job is an honest man, as good and pious as could be, a living embodiment of God's grace on earth. The devil, however, had a different opinion. Of course he is true to you, he says, addressing God, and here he gestures to Job's loving wife, his healthy children, and his wealth. You have given him everything that is good in life. So the devil makes a wager with God. He then proceeds to remove, one by one, all of the blessings that God had bestowed upon Job as a means of testing his faith. Before long, Job has lost everything. His lands and his wealth have been taken from him. His family have been killed. He is nothing but a broken man covered in these agonizing boils. And yet still he does not relinquish his faith in God. Furthermore, when Job confronts God with this, when he questions why he who had done nothing wrong is being tortured in this way, God becomes riled. He goes on a tirade, asserting his own power over everything in the universe, seeking only to remind Job of his insignificance by comparison. As philosopher Bernardo Kastrup explains, in Jung's analysis, this Old Testament God was omniscient, but he did not know how to consult his omniscience. So ultimately, what Job's suffering offers God is perspective on himself, which up until then he lacked. Remember that in an archetypal reading of these stories, the relationship between the creator and the created is symbiotic. The two are one and the same. God represents the highest aspect of the character's psyches. In the symbolic sense, this process of God descending to the human represents the birth of empathy. Because in the beginning there was only this totality, consciousness, God, whatever you want to call it. Entirely singular, that is, without the ability to metacognize. For anything omnipresent could not know anything about itself, because there would be no space in which to occupy that was not itself, perspective being a necessary prerequisite for knowledge. So human beings who suffer to the extent that they feel apart from are the mere appearance of this self-reflexive quality. The universe knowing itself from a third-party perspective.
We have been deputized by God to help God become more conscious. Now, suddenly, all the suffering is couched in meaning, and that's the mechanism for man's service to God, is to suffer through life in order to self-reflect and think. If we suffer, we stop to think. We accumulate and evolve insights during our lives, and those insights are an offering to God.
Kastrup is an advocate for analytic idealism, the idea that mind is the fundamental, and that the material world we experience is a mere appearance inside consciousness. In this way, the process of birth is a process of disassociation. All religious traditions include some kind of creation myth, then a fool. I like Heidegger's thrownness. It speaks to the violence with which we're spat out, carried on a wave of our mother's amniotic cocktail into a world we did not ask to come into from somewhere we were whole. Someone once said that with its cries, a baby, if it could, would bring down the entire universe. Because here, as the baby knows, and as it will see as it moves through life, is always a wrestling with God. Our instinctive desire to impress our own sense of self-identity on the world runs in parallel with the other side that wants to let go, that wants to be enfolded once more in the arms of the divine. In order to seem separate from the universal whole, the world must divide itself. For things can only be known at all through their opposites. After all, the existence of good, the ability to say that is good, necessitates the existence of bad, a synonym for good being not bad. And so, for creation to exist, for a world to be known, suffering must necessarily exist. It is the price consciousness pays for perceiving itself. For Jung, all was day and night, birth and death, happiness and misery, good and evil. Life is a battleground. It always has been and always will be, and if it were not so, existence would come to an end. Rupert Spira is a philosopher in the Vedantic tradition of non-duality. What makes non-dualism so compelling is the empirical prerequisites that it proposes. There is an undeniable veracity to the process of going back to the I that underpins all experience, of observing how this ontological primary, this vessel of awareness, is the only thing that can be known for certain. There is a sense in which Spira's position is the spiritual equivalent of Kastrup's idealism, and indeed the two are great friends, having arrived at startlingly similar conclusions through approaches that could not be more different. Spira through meditation and the practice of self-inquiry, Kastrup through philosophy and his background in particle physics. In both their respective outlooks, time, space, even our bodies are never found. All that's found is the experiencing of them. And we know from recent discoveries in neuroscience that our experience of the world cannot be trusted. Our sense perceptions have evolved to supply us with data that is conducive to our survival as a species, not necessarily data that is conducive to understanding reality as it actually is. If the mystical traditions across the planet, across time, are to be believed, then everything is, in essence, one. The spaces between things are illusory. So the price of suffering we pay in order to exist is not really a price at all. It only seems to be so long as we identify with the illusion that myself is not also yourself. The other's pain is in reality my pain, and ultimately there is no pain at all, the so-called pain emerging from the sense of separation which is not there, but which, nevertheless, the material world we seem to inhabit is dependent on. As Spira explains,
infinite consciousness can only know infinite consciousness. The infinite cannot know the finite directly. So, in order for there to be manifestation, in order for a world to be known, or an object to be known, infinite consciousness must forget that it is infinite consciousness. It must localize, or at least seem to localize itself, as an apparently separate subject of experience, from whose perspective it is able to know an apparently separate object of experience. So this localizing of itself in the form of the finite mind is the mechanism by which form is known, by which consciousness's inherent formlessness appears as form. But consciousness can only know form through this localized or limited perspective of the finite mind, the apparently separate subject of experience. Now, the finite mind doesn't realize that it is a temporary localization or an apparent limitation of infinite consciousness. It believes that it is a self-existing finite mind.
So it is perspective that enables that part of the psyche, the highest part, to learn about itself. As humans, we are part of an ever-evolving inquiry into the nature of experience itself, and the sufferings of our supposed selves, that with which we identify for the duration of our lives, are offered up to the divine so that it might know itself better. Our strifes are gifts from some small beings, natives of this special hell we create for ourselves, beings nonetheless strong enough to hold it together. Broken in some way, always broken, but always emerging back into the light, saying always, here we are, still here, still alive, ready to suffer more. There's a story about Marie-Louise von Franz and one of her patients. This woman had been coming to see the famed Jungian analyst for many years. She had severe schizophrenia, and her suffering was such that she told von Franz, "What is the meaning of my life? I am ruined. Even the medication isn't helping me anymore. What meaning can you give to my life?" Von Franz replied simply, "You are suffering for God."